William Wallace. You've probably heard of Braveheart, but let me tell you what really happened to William Wallace. Born around 1270 in Scotland, Wallace became the face of Scottish resistance against English rule. He wasn't a nobleman, just a landowner's son who refused to bow to King Edward I. In 1297, Wallace won the impossible victory at Stirling Bridge, defeating a much larger English army. He was knighted and became Guardian of Scotland, but his success made him England's most wanted man. In 1305, he was betrayed near Glasgow and dragged to London in chains. What happened next was designed to destroy not just his body, but his legacy. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was stripped naked and dragged through London's streets tied to a horse. He was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still conscious. His abdomen was sliced open and his intestines pulled out and burned before his eyes. While he was still alive, they castrated him. Finally, he was beheaded and his body cut into 4 pieces. His head was dipped in tar and displayed on London Bridge. His limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth as warnings. But here's what they didn't expect. Instead of breaking Scottish spirit, Wallace's brutal death made him a martyr. Within a year, Robert the Bruce began the rebellion that would win Scotland's independence. Sometimes the cruelest deaths create the most powerful legends. 2. Joan of Arc. Imagine being just 19 years old and burned alive for saving your country. That's exactly what happened to Joan of Arc, and her story will shake you. Born in 1412 to a peasant family in Domremy, France, Joan claimed she heard divine voices at age 13 telling her to drive the English out of France. At 17, she convinced the desperate Dauphin Charles to let her lead his armies. And here's the stunning part. She actually won. In just 9 days in 1429, she broke the siege of Orleans, a victory that changed the 100 Years' War. She stood in armor beside soldiers, took arrows to the shoulder, and inspired a dying nation to fight back. But in 1430, she was captured by Burgundian forces and sold to the English for 10,000 francs. The English couldn't execute a war hero, so they put her on trial for heresy and witchcraft. After a year of imprisonment and a sham trial, she was found guilty of 12 charges, including wearing men's clothing. On May 30th, 1431, in Rouen marketplace, Joan was chained to a tall pillar and surrounded by wood. The executioner was ordered to build the fire high, so the crowd couldn't grant her mercy with a quick death. As the flames consumed her, she cried out "Jesus" 6 times. Her body was burned 3 times to ensure nothing remained, and her ashes were thrown into the Seine River. 25 years later, the church reversed the verdict. In 1920, she became a saint. Her death proved that sometimes history's greatest heroes die as criminals. Jacques De Molay. Let me tell you about a man who cursed a king with his dying breath, and that curse seemed to come true. Jacques de Molay was the 23rd and last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, one of the wealthiest and most powerful military orders in medieval Europe. Born around 1240, de Molay joined the Templars as a young man and rose through the ranks during the Crusades. By 1292, he led an organization with immense wealth, land across Europe, and the loyalty of thousands of warrior monks. But their success made them dangerous. King Philip IV of France owed the Templars massive debts he couldn't repay. So on Friday, October 13, 1307, Philip orchestrated a coordinated arrest of hundreds of Templars across France. They were accused of heresy, idol worship, and obscene rituals. Under torture, many confessed to false charges. De Molay was imprisoned for 7 years. At 70 years old, broken by torture and isolation, he initially confessed, but on March 18, 1314, when brought before Notre Dame Cathedral to publicly confirm his guilt, De Molay did something extraordinary. He recanted everything and proclaimed the Templars innocent. King Philip was furious. That same evening, De Molay was taken to a small island in the Seine River. He was slowly roasted to death over a low fire, a method designed to maximize suffering. Legend says as flames consumed him, he cursed both King Philip and Clement V to meet him before God's judgment within a year. Clement died 33 days later. Philip died 8 months after that. The Templar curse became one of history's most chilling coincidences.
Hugh Despenser the Younger. Power, greed, and a king's love. This is the story of the most hated man in medieval England and his horrific end. Hugh Despenser the Younger was born around 1286 into English nobility. Handsome, intelligent, and ambitious, he became the closest advisor and rumored lover of King Edward II. By the 1320s, Despenser essentially controlled England. He seized lands, extorted nobles, and enriched himself beyond measure, while Edward ignored his duties for Despenser's company. The kingdom's hatred for him grew so intense that nobles forced Edward to exile him in 1321. But Edward brought him back within months, triggering a civil war. Queen Isabella, Edward's neglected wife, invaded England in 1326 with her lover Roger Mortimer and a rebel army. Despenser and Edward fled, but Despenser was captured in November 1326. His trial lasted 1 day. He was charged with treason, theft, and leading the king into tyranny. What happened on November 24, 1326, was designed as the ultimate punishment. Despenser was tied to 4 horses and dragged through Hereford, while crowds pelted him with filth and stones. Verses mocking him were nailed to his body. He was stripped naked, and biblical passages condemning sodomy were written on his skin. He was hanged from a 50-foot gallows, but cut down while alive. His genitals were sliced off and burned before his eyes as punishment for his alleged relationship with the king. Then his abdomen was opened and his intestines pulled out. He was finally beheaded and his body cut into quarters. His head joined Wallace's on London Bridge. His brutal execution was witnessed by thousands, including Queen Isabella herself. Even King Edward couldn't save his favorite from England's rage. Edward II. From a king on a throne to a murdered prisoner, Edward II's downfall is one of history's most dramatic reversals. Born in 1284, Edward was the first English Prince of Wales, son of the formidable Edward I, Hammer of the Scots. But he would become known as one of England's weakest kings. Edward's reign, beginning in 1307, was marked by military disasters, noble rebellions, and his controversial relationships with male favorites, first Piers Gaveston, then Hugh Despenser the Younger. While his predecessors conquered territories, Edward lost battles and alienated his barons through favoritism and poor judgment. His wife, Isabella of France, humiliated by his preference for Despenser, became his nemesis. In 1326, she invaded with her lover Mortimer. Edward was captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son. He became the first English king to be formally deposed. But here's where the story becomes truly dark. Imprisoned at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, Edward was held under brutal conditions, moved between dungeons, likely starved, and psychologically tortured. On September 21, 1327, he died under mysterious circumstances. The official story said natural causes. But contemporary chronicles tell a different, horrifying tale. According to several accounts, Edward was murdered in a way that would leave no external marks. A red-hot poker or iron spit was inserted into his rectum, burning his internal organs. His screams were reportedly heard throughout the castle. Whether this gruesome method was actually used remains debated by historians. What's certain is that his death was convenient for Isabella and Mortimer, who ruled through his young son. No autopsy was allowed. Edward was buried quickly at Gloucester Cathedral, where his tomb became an unexpected pilgrimage site. The fallen king, possibly murdered in the most degrading way imaginable, became a martyr in death. Conradin. Picture this: you're 16 years old, the last hope of a royal dynasty, and you're about to be beheaded in a public square for claiming what's rightfully yours. That's the tragedy of Conradin von Hohenstaufen, whose execution changed European politics forever. Born in 1552, Conradin was the grandson of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II and the last legitimate male heir of the mighty Hohenstaufen dynasty. His birthright included claims to Sicily, Jerusalem, and the Holy Roman Empire itself. But Pope Clement IV had other plans. He wanted the Hohenstaufens destroyed and backed Charles of Anjou for the Sicilian throne. At just 15 in 1267, Conradin led an army from Germany into Italy to reclaim his kingdom. Thousands rallied to the Hohenstaufen banner. Initially, he won victories and was welcomed as a liberator. For a brief moment, this teenager looked unstoppable. But on August 23, 1268, at the Battle of Tagliazzo, Charles of Anjou's superior tactics crushed Conradin's forces. The boy king fled, but was betrayed and captured. Charles faced a dilemma. Conradin was a consecrated king, and executing royalty was virtually unprecedented. But keeping him alive meant constant rebellions. Charles chose the unthinkable. On October 29, 1268, in Naples Market Square, a scaffold was erected. Conradin was brought out in chains before a massive crowd. He reportedly threw his glove into the crowd, a gesture passing his claim to his cousin, and declared his innocence. The executioner's sword fell, severing the head of the last Hohenstaufen. He was just 16 years old. The crowd was shocked into silence. Charles had murdered anointed royalty. The execution haunted Charles. Within 14 years, Sicily rose in the Sicilian Vespers Rebellion, massacring French occupiers and ending Charles's dynasty. Conradin's death became a rallying cry. The boy king's execution proved that killing a rightful heir doesn't kill the idea they represent.
Jan Hus. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is tell the truth. Jan Hus discovered this when he was burned alive for challenging church corruption and sparked a revolution that wouldn't die with him. Born around 1372 in Husinec, Bohemia, modern Czech Republic, Hus rose from peasant origins to become a respected priest, preacher, and rector of Charles University in Prague. In an era when the Catholic Church sold salvation through indulgences and many clergy lived in luxury while preaching poverty, Hus dared to speak out. Influenced by English reformer John Wycliffe, Hus preached in Czech rather than Latin so common people could understand. He argued that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate authority. He denounced clerical corruption and called for reform. His sermons at Bethlehem Chapel in Prague drew thousands. He became a hero to Czech nationalism and religious reform. But in 1414, he was summoned to the Council of Constance to defend his views. Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund promised him safe conduct. Hus went willingly, confident in his arguments. It was a trap. Upon arrival, he was arrested and imprisoned in a Dominican monastery, then transferred to a dungeon where he was chained in painful positions and interrogated for months. The council demanded he recant ideas he'd never even taught. When he refused to confess to false charges, they condemned him as a heretic. On July 6, 1415, Hus was taken to a field outside Constance. A paper crown painted with demons was placed on his head, labeled Arch-Heretic. He was chained to a stake, and bundles of wood and straw piled around him to his neck. Given one final chance to recant, Huss refused, saying, "God is my witness that I have never taught or preached that which false witnesses have testified against me." The fire was lit. As flames engulfed him, witnesses reported he sang hymns for several minutes before smoke silenced him. His ashes were thrown into the Rhine River to prevent relics. But you can't burn an idea. His followers, the Hussites, launched a 20-year rebellion that defeated 5 crusades. Jan Hus's death lit a fire that eventually helped ignite the Protestant Reformation a century later. Girolamo Savonarola. From spiritual revolutionary to burning corpse in just 4 years, Girolamo Savonarola's rise and fall is one of history's most dramatic. Born in 1552 in Ferrara, Italy, Savonarola joined the Dominican order and became a preacher known for apocalyptic sermons predicting divine judgment on corrupt Renaissance Italy. In 1490, he arrived in Florence, the jewel of the Renaissance, ruled by the wealthy Medici family. While art and philosophy flourished, Savonarola saw moral decay. His fiery sermons attracted massive crowds. He condemned wealth, vanity, corruption in the church, and sexual immorality. When the Medicis were expelled in 1494, Savonarola became Florence's spiritual leader. He established what he called a Christian commonwealth, banning gambling, homosexuality, and secular art. His followers held bonfires of the vanities, where Florentines burned mirrors, cosmetics, fine clothes, artworks, and books, including works by Botticelli and Michelangelo. But Savonarola's power made dangerous enemies. He denounced Pope Alexander VI, one of the most corrupt popes in history, calling him a false prophet. The pope excommunicated him in 1497 and demanded his arrest. Florentine support began wavering. In 1498, he agreed to an ordeal by fire to prove God's favor, but it was canceled due to rain. The crowd, feeling cheated, turned on him. He was arrested along with 2 followers. For 22 days, Savonarola was tortured with the strappado, his hands tied behind his back, hoisted by a rope, then dropped suddenly, dislocating his shoulders repeatedly. He eventually signed a confession, which he immediately recanted. On May 23, 1498, in Florence's Piazza della Signoria, the same square where he'd held his bonfires, Savonarola and his 2 companions were hanged from a single cross-shaped gibbet. While they still hung, a fire was lit beneath them. Their bodies burned for hours until nothing remained but ash. Those ashes were thrown into the Arno River. The man who burned vanities died in flames himself. Yet even today, some in Florence consider him a prophet who saw the truth about Renaissance excess. Thomas Becket. Sometimes friendship with a king is the most dangerous position of all. Thomas Becket learned this when his best friend ordered his murder in one of Christianity's most sacred spaces. Born around 1119 in London to a merchant family, Becket was educated, charming, and ambitious. He became close friends with King Henry II and was appointed Chancellor of England in 1155, essentially the king's right-hand man. They hunted together, drank together, and governed together. He lived in luxury, enjoying wealth and power. Then, in 1162, Henry made what seemed like a brilliant move, appointing his loyal friend as Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting him to help him control the church. But something unexpected happened. Becket took his spiritual role seriously. He transformed from a lavish courtier into an austere priest, wearing hair shirts beneath his robes and defending church rights against royal power. The friendship shattered. For years, Henry and Becket clashed over whether clergy accused of crimes should be tried in church courts or royal courts. In 1164, Becket fled England, fearing arrest. He spent 6 years in exile. In 1170, they reconciled, or seemed to. Becket returned to Canterbury,
But on December 29, 1170, after Becket excommunicated bishops loyal to Henry, the king allegedly cried out in frustration, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took this as an order. They rode to Canterbury Cathedral and confronted Becket during evening prayers. They demanded he absolute the bishops. He refused. They tried to drag him outside to avoid defiling the church, but Becket clung to a pillar. One knight struck him in the head with a sword. Another blow drove him to his knees. A third strike split his skull open. A fourth blow was so violent it broke the sword on the stone floor and scattered Becket's brains across the cathedral. The murder of an archbishop in his own cathedral shocked all Europe. Henry was forced to do public penance, walking barefoot through Canterbury while monks whipped him. Becket was declared a saint within 3 years. His shrine became one of Christianity's most important pilgrimage sites. The king's anger killed his friend, but it created a martyr whose cult would outlast them both.
Enguerrand de Marigny. Power, corruption, and a spectacular fall from grace. Enguerrand de Marigny went from ruling France to hanging in chains, and his execution invented a new phrase in French language. Born around 1260 into minor Norman nobility, Marigny possessed exceptional administrative talent. He rose through royal service to become the closest advisor to King Philip IV the Fair, the same king who destroyed the Templars. By 1311, Marigny was essentially Prime Minister of France, controlling finances, foreign policy, and royal appointments. For over a decade, he was untouchable. He reformed France's monetary system, fortified defenses, and conducted diplomatic negotiations. He also grew spectacularly wealthy through bribes, embezzlement, and land seizures. His enemies were numerous, but while Philip lived, Marigny was safe. Then, Philip IV died suddenly in 1414, just 8 months after Jacques De Molay's curse. Philip's son, Louis X, inherited the throne and a kingdom full of nobles who hated Marigny. They pounced immediately. Marigny was arrested in 1515 and charged with embezzlement, forgery, and, most seriously, sorcery. His accusers claimed he'd used black magic to influence the old king and had consulted with a magician named Paviot to harm the royal family through witchcraft. These charges were likely fabricated, but they were politically convenient. The trial was a foregone conclusion. On April 30th, 1515, Marigny was taken to Montfaucon, the massive stone gibbet outside Paris where criminals were hung and their bodies left to rot as warnings. But here's what made it particularly brutal. Marigny was hung using his own funds. The execution was paid for through his confiscated fortune. He strangled slowly on the gibbet while a crowd of nobles watched, many of whom he'd once ruled over. His body hung in chains at Montfaucon for 2 years, exposed to weather and carrion birds until it was nothing but bones. His spectacular fall gave French language a new expression. The gibbet of Montfaucon became synonymous with justice for corrupt officials. From controlling a kingdom to rotting in public view, Marigny's death proved that in medieval politics, the higher you climb, the harder you fall. Ines de Castro. This is the story of a woman murdered for love who became a queen after death. Ines de Castro's tale is so tragic and bizarre that it blurs the line between history and legend. Born around 1325 into Galician nobility, Ines came to Portugal as a lady-in-waiting to Constanza Manuel, who married Prince Pedro, heir to the Portuguese throne. But Pedro fell deeply in love not with his wife, but with Ines. Their affair was an open secret at court. When Constanza died in 1345, Pedro refused to remarry for political purposes. Instead, he lived openly with Ines at the castle of Coimbra. They had 4 children together. Pedro's father, Alfonso IV, was horrified. Ines had connections to Castilian nobility, Portugal's greatest rival. He feared her children would have claims to the throne, potentially dragging Portugal into Castilian control. For years, Alfonso pressured Pedro to abandon her. Pedro refused. The king's advisors warned that Ines was a threat to Portuguese independence. Finally, while Pedro was away hunting, on January 7, 1355, Alfonso made his move. 3 nobles, Pero Coello, Álvaro Gonçalves, and Diogo López Pacheco, went to Ines's residence in Coimbra. Some accounts say King Alfonso himself was there. Ines reportedly fell to her knees, pleading for mercy, showing her children, begging to be exiled rather than killed. They murdered her anyway. The exact method varies in different chronicles. Some say she was beheaded, others say stabbed, others still say her throat was cut. What's certain is that she died violently, and her blood stained the gardens. When Pedro learned of her death, he went mad with grief and rage. He launched a brutal civil war against his own father. After becoming king in 1357, Pedro captured 2 of the assassins. His revenge was horrific. He had their hearts ripped out, one through the chest, one through the back, while they still lived. But here's where history becomes legend. Pedro declared that he had secretly married Ines before her death, making her Portugal's rightful queen. He had her body exhumed, dressed in royal garments, crowned, and placed on a throne. He allegedly forced the entire court to kneel and kiss her decomposed hand, paying homage to their dead queen. Ines was reburied in an elaborate tomb at Alcobaça monastery, foot to foot with Pedro's tomb, so they could see each other on Resurrection Day. Her inscription reads, Até o fim do mundo, which means, until the end of the world. Murdered for love, crowned in death, Ines de Castro became Portugal's eternal queen. Richard II. From absolute monarch to starving prisoner, Richard II's death remains one of England's darkest royal mysteries. Born in 1367, Richard became king at just 10 years old after his grandfather Edward III's death. He grew into an intelligent but increasingly tyrannical ruler who believed in the divine right of kings. Richard's early reign showed promise. At 14, he personally confronted the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, showing remarkable courage. But as he matured, he became paranoid, vengeful, and autocratic. In 1397–98, he moved against former opponents, executing or exiling nobles in what became known as the Revenge Parliament. His greatest mistake was exiling his cousin Henry Bolingbroke and seizing his massive inheritance. In 1399, while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, Henry invaded England. Support for Richard collapsed almost instantly. Nobles and commoners alike had tired of his tyranny. Richard returned to find himself abandoned. He was captured at Conway Castle and taken to the Tower of London. On September 29, 1399, in a forced ceremony, Richard read a document of abdication, handing the crown to Henry, who became Henry IV. But an abdicated king is a dangerous thing, a living rallying point for rebellion. Richard was moved to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, one of England's most remote and secure fortresses. Then, in February 1400, news spread. Richard was dead. The official story claimed he had voluntarily starved himself to death out of grief, but nobody believed it. Contemporary chronicles suggest several possibilities: that he was deliberately starved to death on Henry's orders, that he was murdered outright, or that he was beaten and then denied food. One account says Richard resisted starvation and was killed by Sir Piers Exton, who struck him down with an axe. Another suggests he was suffocated or strangled. What's certain is that Henry IV needed him dead, and Richard died in convenient obscurity. Henry had Richard's body displayed in London to prove he was dead, but the face was covered, supposedly to preserve dignity, more likely to hide evidence of violence. Richard was just 33 years old. For years afterwards, rumors persisted that Richard had escaped and was alive in Scotland. So dangerous was the idea that he might return. The king who demanded absolute obedience died alone, possibly murdered, definitely betrayed.
a reminder that in medieval politics, the crown you wear can become the target on your back.
Brunhilda of Austrasia. What you're about to hear sounds like something from a horror story, but it's history. The brutal execution of a 70-year-old queen torn apart by horses. Brunhilda's death was so savage it shocked even the brutal Merovingian age. Born around 543 in Visigothic Spain, Brunhilda was a princess known for beauty, intelligence, and education, rare qualities in the early medieval period. She married Sigebert I, King of Austrasia, part of the Frankish kingdoms in modern France and Germany, in 567. But her sister, Galswintha, married Sigebert's brother, King Chilperic I of Neustria, and was mysteriously murdered, likely by Chilperic's mistress, Fredegund. This sparked a 40-year blood feud between two queens across two kingdoms. Brunhilda versus Fredegund became legendary for its violence and intrigue. After Sigebert was assassinated in 575, Brunhilda spent decades fighting to maintain power, ruling as regent through her son, then her grandsons. She was politically brilliant but ruthless, making countless enemies among the Frankish nobility who resented being ruled by a woman. In 613, when she was around 70 years old, Brunhilda's enemies finally succeeded. Clotaire II, son of her old enemy Fredegund, captured her after a military defeat. What happened next was designed not just to kill her, but to utterly humiliate and destroy her. Brunhilda was brought before Clotaire's army and subjected to 3 days of torture and public humiliation. She was paraded before troops who mocked her. Chronicles describe various torments, though exact details vary. Then came the execution. Brunhilda was tied by her hair, one arm, and one leg to the tail of a wild, unbroken horse. The horse was whipped into a frenzy and sent galloping across rough terrain. Her elderly body was literally torn apart, smashed against rocks, ripped by the violent motion, bones shattered. The torture lasted until she was unrecognizable. What remained of her body was eventually burned and the ashes scattered. It was one of the most brutal executions in medieval history, inflicted on an elderly woman whose only crime was refusing to surrender power in a male-dominated world. Brunhilda ruled for nearly 40 years through intelligence and determination. Her horrific death didn't erase her legacy. It became a cautionary tale about the deadly price of female ambition in the early Middle Ages. Peter of Verona. Imagine hunting down heretics your entire life, only to be murdered by one in the most ironic way possible. That's the story of Peter of Verona, whose brutal assassination made him a martyr and fueled the Inquisition he served. Born around 1206 in Verona, Italy, Peter grew up in a family suspected of Catharian heresy, a Christian sect the Catholic Church considered dangerously heretical. But Peter rejected his family's beliefs and joined the Dominican order, becoming a preacher and inquisitor with a singular mission: destroying the very heresy his family embraced. By the 1240s, Peter was one of the most effective and feared inquisitors in northern Italy. Appointed by Pope Gregory IX, he operated primarily in Milan and Como, regions where Catholicism was widespread. Peter was charismatic, persuasive, and absolutely relentless. His sermons converted thousands. His investigations led to numerous arrests, confessions, and executions of heretics. He made powerful enemies. The Cathars and their supporters despised him as a traitor and persecutor. In 1252, a group of Milanese Cathars decided to solve their Peter problem permanently. They hired an assassin named Carino of Balsamo, himself a former Catholic who'd converted to Catharism. On April 6, 1252, Peter was traveling from Como to Milan with a companion, a Dominican friar named Dominic. They were ambushed in a forest near Barlacina. Carino and his accomplices attacked with weapons. Peter was struck in the head with an axe or sword. The blade cleaved deep into his skull. As he fell, bleeding and dying, legend says he dipped his finger in his own blood and wrote on the ground, "Credo in Deum, I believe in God." He managed to recite the beginning of the Apostles' Creed before a second blow killed him. His companion, Dominic, was also murdered. Their bodies were left in the forest. The reaction was immediate and intense. Peter was declared a martyr within days. Miracles were reported at his tomb. Less than a year later, in 1253, Pope Innocent IV canonized him as Saint Peter Martyr, one of the fastest canonizations in church history. His death had the exact opposite effect the Cathars intended. Instead of weakening the Inquisition, Peter's martyrdom energized it. His death became propaganda for intensified persecution. Carino, the assassin, was reportedly captured and executed, though some legends claim he repented and became a lay brother. Peter of Verona died as he lived, in conflict with heresy. His murder with an axe to the head became iconic in religious art, depicted in countless paintings and sculptures. The Inquisitor became a saint, and his death justified decades of intensified inquisitorial activity. Edmund Ironside. Some medieval deaths were heroic battles, others were assassinations. And then there's Edmund Ironside, possibly murdered in the most undignified way imaginable while using a primitive toilet. Yes, you heard that right. Born around 900, Edmund was the son of King Aethelred the Unready, whose disastrous reign left England vulnerable to Viking invasion. When the Danish king, Sweyn Forkbeard, and his son Canute invaded, Edmund proved to be everything his father wasn't: brave, strong, and a brilliant military leader. He earned his nickname Ironside for his warrior prowess and seemingly indestructible nature in battle. After Aethelred died in Athol 16, Edmund became king of England, but he faced Canute's massive Viking army. For months, the two fought across England in a series of brutal battles. Edmund won several engagements, proving himself Canute's equal. England was being torn apart. Finally, in late Athol 16, they agreed to divide the kingdom. Edmund would rule Wessex in the south, Canute would take Mercia and the north. It seemed like peace at last. Then, on November 30th, 1016, just weeks after the agreement, Edmund died suddenly at Oxford. He was only about 26 years old. The official cause was listed as natural death, but almost immediately rumors of foul play spread. Here's where it gets dark and bizarre. According to chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, writing about a century later, Edmund was murdered by an assassin named Adric Striona, who had switched sides between Edmund and Canute multiple times. The method? The assassin allegedly hid in the pit beneath the king's prieve, a cesspit where waste collected. When Edmund sat down to relieve himself, the assassin thrust a sharp dagger or sword upward through the toilet hole, stabbing Edmund in the bowels from below. Some versions say it was a crossbow bolt or a sharpened pole. The wound was internal, deep, and fatal. Edmund died in agony from the injury and likely infection. Another account from John of Worcester suggests Edmund was stabbed twice in the lower parts while on the toilet by the son of Adric Striona, acting on the orders of Canute. How much of this is true? We'll never know for certain. Medieval chroniclers loved a dramatic story, and toilet assassinations appear in other legends. What's undeniable is that Edmund's sudden, convenient death left Canute as undisputed king of all England. Whether murdered ignobly on a toilet or killed by poison or disease, Edmund Ironside's death ended Anglo-Saxon resistance and began Canute's Danish dynasty. The warrior who couldn't be killed in battle possibly died in the most humiliating circumstances imaginable.
A reminder that in medieval politics, you were never safe, not even in the most private moments.